Bones of the visceral cranium are very important because they form receptacles of organs of taste, for example, organs of vision, opening into the alimentary canal, that's the oral cavity, and nasal cavity for the respiratory system. Right, so in this video, we are going to talk about maxilla, palatine bones, and the inferior nasal conchae. Right, so it's the second part of topic 7 and 8. Right, so we're going to start with the maxilla. Right, so you can see it in green here. Right, this is the maxilla. And this is side view of the maxilla. Right, so maxilla is actually a paired bone of a complex structure determined by diversity of its function. It takes part in the formation of the orbital, nasal, and oral cavities, and in the network of masticatory apparatus, right? Okay, so this bone, like I told you, is paired, right? So they are two, and they are united together at the intermaxillary suture to form the skeleton of the upper jaw and the skeleton of the face between the mouth and the eyes. All right, so you see, right? So this is the left maxilla and the right maxilla. You can see this suture, right? The intermaxillary suture. All right, so these two bones surround the anterior nasal aperture, right? So that anterior nasal aperture surrounded there is called a piriform aperture, apertura piriformis, right? It's a pear-shaped, right? So look here, this is the apertura piriformis, this around here, apertura piriformis, right? So parts of the maxilla: a body and four processes, right? So the body of the maxilla, corpus maxillae, is a hollow and contains a very large maxillary sinus, right? It's very large, and it's important in making the weight of the skull light, and also it's a very important sinus if we talk about like a resonance and other functions, right? So these are the processes. The frontal process, processus frontalis, this articulates with the frontal and the nasal and the lacrimal bones. The next process is the zygomatic process, processus zygomaticus. This process actually articulates with the zygomatic bone, and the palatine process, processus palatinus. This process articulates like with its mate on the other side to form the most part of the hard palate. All right, I'm going to show you the palatine process is very important. And lastly, the alveolar process, right? So the processus alveolaris forms the sockets of the upper maxillary teeth or the upper jaw, right? Okay, so here I want to show you the processes, right? You can see here is the frontal process, processus frontalis. Here is the zygomatic process, is cut here, processus zygomaticus. And here there is alveolar process, right? Or alveolar arch, arcus alveolaris, right? This arch, but the process is called what? The alveolar process, processus alveolaris. Okay, here I want to show you again another view, right? So here is everything, right? So you can see the nasal aperture, the frontal process. What else? This one is the alveolar process, right? Don't worry about the other labels. This is the zygomatic process, processus zygomaticus. All right. This one is the medial view. On the medial view, you can see it horizontally, palatine process, processus palatinus, right? So, like these two processes of two maxillae, they combine in the midline to form the most part of the hard palate. All right, so this is the inferior view, right? So you can see this palatine process, right? So they are joining here on the middle, right? So this whole thing is the bony part, or the bony part of the maxillary process, right? So I said the palatine process of the maxilla forms the greater part. The small part is formed by another bone, which we'll cover later, the palatine bones, and there are two again, right? Okay, let's talk about the body first. The body of the maxilla, corpus maxillae, right? The body contains a large air sinus called the maxillary sinus, sinus maxillaris, or sinus antrum hymori, right? So inflammation of the maxillary sinus is sometimes known as hymoritis. This sinus communicates with the nasal cavity by a wide opening called the maxillary hiatus. The hiatus maxillaris here, right? So you can see this is the hiatus maxillaris, right? Yeah, that's what I want to show you for now. Okay, let's continue. On the body, you can see four surfaces, right? The anterior surface faces anterior, the orbital surface faces orbitalis, the nasal surface faces nasalis, and the infratemporal surface faces infratemporalis. Right, okay. So firstly here we can see the anterior surface faces anterior, right? So this is the anterior surface, right? What can you see there? Right, so firstly you can see the infraorbital margin, this margin, infraorbital margin, margo infraorbitalis. You can also see the foramen, the infraorbital foramen is below the orbit, below this margin, infraorbital foramen, foramen infraorbitale. You can also see a notch, a nasal notch, right? So this half combining with the other half, that's what forms what? The aperture, right? Okay, and then there is this depression is very important, called fossa canina here, fossa canina. And here there is this spine, the nasal spine, anterior nasal spine, spina nasalis anterior. Here, okay, you can also see the lacrimal notch, right? Incisura lacrimalis here, incisura lacrimalis. That's where the lacrimal bone will lodge into. And this is the zygomatic process, processus zygomaticus, right? Right. So that so this part, that's the anterior surface, right? This is the orbital surface. Inside this is the orbital surface. Facies orbitalis, right? What can you see there? In the orbital surface, I will show you. But for now, this is the orbital surface, just to know that. And this is the infratemporal surface, facies infratemporalis. This, right? Okay. So on the orbital surface, this is what you see. Firstly, there is these canals, right? They are called what? Infraorbital canal, right? So this infraorbital canal, canalis infraorbitalis, it begins like here firstly as infraorbital sulcus, right? Infraorbital sulcus, and then through the alveolar foramina, that's foraminum alveolarium, they will go deep, forming what? Entering into this canal, canalis infraorbitalis, right? Right. They also extend down with it in the thickness of the maxilla, right? So you can see again here, canalis alveolaris, right? For carrying different nerves and vessels of the upper teeth, right? You can also see here on the infratemporal surface, facies infratemporalis, you can see the foramina alveolaria, right? and the canals, the corresponding canals, canales alveolaris. Next is the nasal surface, facies nasalis. Right, so on this surface, you can see the important crest, crista ethmoidalis here, and crista conchalis, right? So here is for the crest corresponding to the ethmoid bone, and here crista conchalis for the nasal concha, right? And here you can see the palatine processus palatinus, right? So if it combines, it forms the roof of the oral cavity, or we can say separating the oral cavity down here from the nasal cavity up here, right? So that's the nasal surface for you, facies nasalis, right? Okay, and the infratemporal surface, I showed you the infratemporal surface already, right? So here I have another view, another inferior view, right? So this is the inferior view. These are the palatine processes. Processus palatinus. Processus palatinus. And there is a suture in between, sutura palatina mediana. There is a very small bone here, anteriorly here. It's called the incisivum, os incisivum. And there's a foramen called foramen incisivum here. And in between there is a suture, sutura incisivum, right? A suture between the what? Between the palatine processes of the maxilla and the incisivum, os incisivum. Right. You can also see the zygomatic processus zygomaticus. Right. Okay. Right. The next bone is the palatine bone, right? I already introduced it, right? The palatine bone. Again, same as maxilla, is a paired bone. It contributes to the formation of the cranial cavities, namely the cavity of the nose, mouth, orbits, the pterygopalatine fossa, which determines its peculiar structure, right? So firstly, I'd like to show you what it looks like, right? So this is the palatine bone, right, on the inferior view. In blue again is the palatine bone, right? And again here you can see it, palatine bone, right? And the one we covered, the maxilla, you see it, maxilla forming the anterior part of the roof of the oral cavity, and the posterior, you see, is formed by this plate of the what? Of the palatine bone. I will tell you the name of this plate, right? Parts of the palatine bone, right? So the palatine bone consists of the perpendicular plate and the horizontal plate, right? It also have three processes. These processes are the pyramidal process, processus pyramidalis, the orbital process, processus orbitalis, and the sphenoid process, processus sphenoidalis, right? So here I will just want to show you the what the perpendicular plate and the horizontal plate, right? So this going up here is the what? Is the perpendicular plate, and here is the horizontal plate, lamina horizontalis, right? This is lamina perpendicularis. Okay, so let's start with the perpendicular plate, lamina perpendicularis. Right, so it is two surfaces, the lateral surface and the medial surface, right? Let's start with the lateral surface. The perpendicular plate adjoins the nasal surface of the maxilla. It is the greater palatine groove, sulcus palatinus major, which passes along its lateral surface. In an intact skull, this groove unites with the same groove on the maxilla and is converted into a greater palatine canal, canalis palatinus major. What's important about this canal? This canal transmits the greater palatine nerves and vessels, right? So you can see here this sulcus palatinus major, right? So this is the sulcus I am talking about, right? So that was about the what? The lateral surface. Let's see the medial surface. Right, so the medial surface takes part in the formation of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, and it is two crests for two nasal conchae, right? The first one is the ethmoidal crest, crista ethmoidalis, which gives attachment to the medial nasal concha, and the conchal crest, crista ethmoidalis, which gives attachment to the inferior nasal concha, right? So here is the medial surface, right? So crista ethmoidalis for the medial nasal concha is here, and crista conchalis for the inferior nasal concha here. Let's look at the horizontal plate. The horizontal plate, lamina horizontalis, completes the maxillary palatine process posteriorly to form the bony palate, palatum osseum. Right. So its medial border meets the medial border of the contralateral bone to form the crest, the nasal crest, crista nasalis, on the superior surface. I will show you that crest. On the inferior surface of the bony palate, just behind the lateral part of the palatomaxillary suture, there is a greater palatine foramen, foramen palatinum majus, just which leads to the greater palatine canal, canalis palatinus major. I told you about this, right? So I told you that it's formed by what? There is a sulcus, sulcus major, sulcus palatinus major, right? This same sulcus on the maxilla form a canal. This canal is important for transmitting the nerves and the vessels. And then on the opening, which I am going to show you right now, you are going to see its exit, right? There is a lesser palatine canals, canales palatine minores, right? So these ones also penetrate it vertically, right? What? Penetrating the palate, transmitting the nerves and the vessels, right? Okay, so this is the horizontal plate. One more thing, I only mentioned the three processes like which project from the perpendicular and the horizontal plate of the palatine bone, right? So this is the orbital process, processus orbitalis. This is the sphenoid process, processus sphenoidalis, right? So the body of the sphenoid will lodge here, forming a foramen, right? At the moment, it's a notch, incisura sphenopalatina, right? The sphenopalatine notch. But if the body is here, it will become a foramen, right? Sphenopalatine foramen, right? And that's the two processes, orbital and sphenoidal. And then the other process, pyramidal process, processus pyramidalis, is this one, right? Okay, right. So you can see here is the greater palatine foramen, right? Greater palatine foramen. And outside the square, you can see the lesser palatine foramen, right? So these are the palatine processes of the maxilla, forming the anterior part or the most part of the bony palate. And then on the back here, you can see these horizontal plates. These are horizontal plates of the what? Of the palatine bone. All right. And then the last bone we are going to cover in this video is called the inferior nasal concha, concha nasalis inferior. Right, the inferior nasal concha is they're paired, right? It's a paired. Okay, so unlike the middle nasal concha and superior nasal concha, which are part of the ethmoid bone, The inferior nasal conchae is actually an independent bone, which is thin and curved, right? Its upper edge articulates with the conchal crest of the maxilla and the conchal crest of the palate, right? So on the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. Its inferior edge is free, and the inferior nasal conchae isolate the middle nasal meatus from the inferior nasal meatus, right? I will show you this again, maybe in skull as a whole. In the next video, we will talk about the nasal bones, the lacrimal bones, and the zygomatic. Right. Until next time.